Guys, what's up? How's it going? It's John. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's good to have you guys here. This video, I want to talk about the Console Wars, which is a new documentary that came out earlier this year in, I believe, March timeframe, but it just got released on CBS All Access, which is a streaming service here in North America, or at least in the U.S. And it's a great documentary. I watched it last night, and I want to talk about the Console Wars. And the Console Wars refers to the time in the 90s, the early 90s, when the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were duking it out. And this, to me, I think was probably the most exciting time. I'm a little biased because I grew up in this decade, right? But to me, this was an exciting time for gaming. I mean, the history. And I learned so much watching this documentary. I didn't know that, for example, Sega and Sony were in talks to work together. I knew Nintendo and Sony they were working together. In fact, they had that prototype, the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, which is awesome. Got to see in person, which is cool. But I had no idea that Sega was potentially with Sony. That's awesome. And just the fact that Nintendo owned like 95% of the market share in the late 80s, early 90s, and what Sega of America had to do to penetrate the marketplace. So what they essentially had to do is really geared towards an older audience. Hence, they really talk about Mortal Kombat when that game came out for both Super Nintendo and Genesis. I remember when that game came out, and Nintendo tamed it down. They got rid of the blood. They turned their blood green. There was a cheat code, I believe, though, that you could unlock the blood. However, that was kind of weak, right? And people, I think they sold like 10 times more Genesis copies of Mortal Kombat than they did for the Super Nintendo. And Nintendo learned their lesson. And of course, when Mortal Kombat 2 came out for the Super Nintendo down the road, eventually, that did have blood. But Nintendo was really more, quote, family friendly. It still is as a company, very much so. But the Genesis was more hardcore. They had a lot more aggressive advertising. They were making fun of Nintendo. You had that famous line, Genesis does what Nintendo don't, that catchphrase, that song, and that really catch on. The whole Sega, you'd watch those commercials and they were like, kids were screaming, Sega! And it's just a really brilliant marketing strategy by Sega. And of course, they made Sonic the Hedgehog the mascot of the Genesis, or the Sega itself. He still is. So it was really cool. And it's really sad to see the downfall of Sega, really, because there was a lot of headbutting between Sega of America and Sega Japan, and a lot of jealousy between the two. And they burned a lot of bridges with the retailers by the time the Saturn hit the market, and a lot of retailers were just burnt out with Sega. So I love Sega as a brand. I love the Genesis. I think it's a great console. If you were to ask me what my favorite console between the Genesis and Super Nintendo, what is it? I'd have to say it really, I know it's kind of a cop-out answer, but it really depends on the genre, the platform of the genre of game, right? So for example, if I'm looking at for platformers, I'd probably go with the Super Nintendo, the Super Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong Country series, etc. Although Sonic is pretty awesome too, don't get me wrong. But if I were to go to like sports franchises, I'd go with the Genesis. You had Joe Montana Talk Football, where the first time I actually played that game where I could hear like a commentator commentate a game. It blew me away back at that technology. And yes, the Super Nintendo was technically superior with more colors, palettes to choose from, and better audio. But the Genesis really took care of a good job of really creating that color palette using what they had available to them. And even the music, the Genesis processor sounds awesome. I just love the sound of the Genesis. I mean, there's some really great games. Phantasy Star, for example, is a really good game. However, if I were to look for overall for RPGs, I'd probably go with the Super Nintendo with Final Fantasy, because they had the exclusives, Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, and Chrono Trigger, some of the adventure games, Zelda. But if you're looking for like beat 'em ups, right, I would go with the Genesis. You had Streets of Rage and things like that. So it really depends on the type of game. But I have a really affinity for the Sega Genesis. I mean, they were the underdogs, right? Nintendo was dominating the market. Nintendo was suing companies left and right, not allowing third-party publishers basically to publish games for other platforms. They were threatening to sue. They were arm-holding retailers, so basically only retailers could display Nintendo stuff. It was really crazy Nintendo strategy, and they just were overconfident, over-cocky. So I want to just take a moment to share my thoughts about the console wars during the 90s. Growing up in this time frame, I was like 10 to 12 years old in the early 90s during when this was happening. And I first purchased a Super Nintendo, and then I eventually got a Genesis down the road. But my neighbor behind me that lived behind me had a Genesis. He also had a Sega Master System. So I was able to play some of the games for the Genesis. And the Genesis, to be quite honest with you, when it first came out, the games weren't that great. You had Altered Beast, for example, and it was a port of an arcade that Sega had done. It wasn't great. I do like Golden Axe, for example. That's a good game. But really, Alex Kidd was their first, quote, mascot before Sonic came out, and Sonic really turned things around. And of course, Sony came around and released the PlayStation later on. It's just interesting to hear that Sony had ties kind of with both companies. And the PlayStation 1 is the best-selling console of all time and just blew everything out of the water, right? But it is sad that Sega is no longer making consoles. I'm really actually sad about that. Dreamcast was the last one they produced, and that was in the late 90s, 1991. Or I'm sorry, 1999, rather. So that came out in the late 90s, and only lasted for a few years. But I love the Dreamcast, and I really wish, and I pray to the gaming gods that Sega releases a Dreamcast 2. I just think Sega has such great IPs. They could do a lot. Anyway, we just want to recommend, guys, watch the Console Wars if you're able to. And I hope it's available for other places for those who don't live in the US, because it is a great documentary. And if I could post it and share it with you guys here on YouTube, of course I would if I could, but I'd get in trouble for that. I'd have to strike and I'd have to take it down. So thanks to YouTube and copyright infringement, right? But I can understand, I can respect that. But anyway, thanks guys for watching. Thanks for leaving a comment. Between the two consoles, Genesis and Super Nintendo, what do you prefer? What is your answer? What do you prefer? And what games do you like for it? Leave a comment below. Thanks for subscribing, guys. As always, we'll take care. See ya. And of course, game on.